So when I'm setting this up, I try to have two different piles going. So that's partly where the newsprint you guys are bringing is going to come in handy. So I'll have a clean side and then like a dirty side. So I've got paper towels here as well. So to do this, we're just using vegetable oil. So fancy print shops actually print their transparencies onto films to make photo positives. We just use thin paper and then just apply vegetable oil to it to make it translucent enough for it to act as a transparency. So it's down to dirty, but it works. So what I typically do is I'll flip my photo positive, my image over, so make it face down. I would suggest trying to wait a little bit too, so give it a few minutes before you actually start doing this. Because if you start putting oil in these as soon as they come out of the printer, the toner might have a tendency to bleed a little bit, especially if you have a lot of big black areas. So let them dry for a little bit, put them face down, and then basically just apply a decent amount of the vegetable oil directly onto the back of your photocopy, and then just start working that in. So as best you can, try to make sure that you don't let the paper get creased or balled up. So just kind of smooth out the oil across the entire back. And again, just use your other hand to try to trap the paper so that it doesn't end up getting torn, obviously, or creased, buckled in any way. Try to keep it nice and flat. And just work it in to where everything's covered. You shouldn't still see any kind of more opaque or like milky areas where it's still the paper. So it should all be nice and translucent. So once the whole back is covered all the way out to the edges, we'll pull it over here to our clean stack. All right, so I'll get a clean paper towel and I'll start wiping the back. So at this point, I'm trying to remove the oily residue. I don't want to have any remnants of oil residue on my paper whatsoever. So I have to do a really thorough job of making sure that that all gets wiped off. If you don't do that, it could compromise the emulsion coating on the screen. It could also affect the way that the light is diffused, and that'll affect the way that your image is burned in the screen itself. So you want to make sure, again, that you remove any of that oily residue. All right, so once the back is wiped pretty thoroughly, I'll take this and flip it over. So I've got a clean side to my newsprint, another paper towel, and so now I'll wipe the front down. Yeah, so just make sure that, again, you're wiping it to where there's not any residue on there, or that'll create some problems. So you guys are welcome to do this out here if you would like to, or you can do it in the back of the screen printing room if you'd like to. That's entirely up to you. Either way, when you're done with these, I would put them on the drying rack, which I'll point out here in a minute. We have two drying racks, one of which we kind of reserve for your prints, and then the other we reserve for transparencies, so that we don't end up with any kind of like oily mess on the drying racks where we're trying to put our prints. So now these are both dirty. I'll just slide these over here to my dirty pile, and I'll pull off some clean newsprint for this side. And yeah, just give it just kind of one more quick wipe down. Make sure there's not any residue on there. Okay, that's good. All right, so we'll set this aside for now. As I said, you can put this in the drying rack next door to make sure that you're using one that's labeled for transparencies. All right, so that's it for making transparencies. So usually put those in the drying rack, let them dry for about 10 or 15 minutes, And then while you're doing that, it's a good time to be toning your screens. So let's go ahead and get that stored, and we'll do that. You just need to have some newsprint or just like a scrap piece of paper handy so that you have somewhere to put your emulsion and put your screens. Before we get into that though, so all of our screens are over here. So like I said, they're all aluminum frame screens. So we have a variety of both sizes of screens and mesh of screens. So the mesh, again, which is a synthetic material. So if you look at the ones that we have on the rack here, you see they have different numbers written on the bottom of them. So those numbers refer to the thread count or the TPI of the screens, right? So the lowest ones that we have here in the shop are 110s, and then we have sort of a range up to the highest that we have are the 305s, okay? So the lower the TPI, the lower the mesh of your screen, that's gonna be best for either printing flats, right, which are like large areas of solid color, or you know, just kind of more simple shapes, right, designs that don't have as many small details, you know, small thin lines. The only disadvantage to the lower mesh screens is that they can be a little bit harder to pull and get a nice flood, so it can require either more pressure and or additional pulls to get an area completely covered. So then as we kind of work our way up, so we've got, like I said, a variety. So we've got some 110s, the smaller screens. We've got some 180s, 200s, 230s, 280s, and up to 305s. So like once you start getting to the higher end, it becomes a little bit more difficult to determine which mesh to use. So if you're unsure of which one to go with, just kind of, you know, let me know. Because yeah, that's really gonna kind of vary depending on just how small some of the points that you have. Pretty much anything if ends up having to be bitmapped, especially you know, if it's a lot of really small details, it's gonna have to be on a 280 or a 305. If you have, you know, some line work, but it's very sort of like clean, you know, dark line work, whatever color ends up being printed as, but just, you know, like clean, well-defined line work, then sometimes you can get away with, you know, like a 180 or a 200. So it's really just going to be on a case-by-case basis, depending on your image, and just, you know, again, how detailed it is and things like that. Our kind of policy that we have in the shop, and this is a smaller class, so it shouldn't be as much of an issue, but to try to make sure that we keep screens in circulation and also just for accountability. When you guys reserve screens, I would prefer that you guys only reserve up to like, you know, 3 at a time, and then just ask that you would just on a piece of like masking tape, whatever, just write your name and the date on there, and that we only hold the screen for a couple of days, right? So that way, you know, if people need to print, the screens aren't all tied up. So just as like a courtesy, also kind of accountability to make sure that we have plenty of screens in circulation. So yeah, just label with your name and date. That way we know whose screen is whose, and we don't just have screens like sitting around for like days and weeks that aren't being used. So I'll just grab one of these just 110s, just for the purposes of showing you guys how to coat a screen. I've got a couple of screens that are in the drying cabinet already. So I've got my screen here. The emulsion we keep in this cabinet, and it's a photosensitive emulsion, which is why we have the lights turned off. So anytime you guys are in here working, just sort of be conscientious and aware to make sure there's not emulsion out, or that the cabinet with the screens in it isn't open. So that's generally why we try to keep that door closed. And so if the door is closed, you give a knock, and just to make sure that there's not anything out that could be affected by even the door from the light. Also, if you need to come in here to get a screen, the drying cabinet, which is right here. So if all you're doing is coming in to get a screen you've already burned, just make sure, again, the overhead lights are off, and that way you can safely access the drying cabinet to get a screen out. Because again, if the overhead lights are on and you open this up, there's a possibility that the screens that are in here that have not yet been exposed could be exposed, and then you have to wash them out and start all over. So the emulsion that you guys will be using, will come out of this small container. I have a gallon container that's already pre-mixed, but so we'll be making sure that this stays full because it's a lot easier to pour your emulsion out of the smaller container than like trying to hold like a giant gallon-sized container to pour out of. It's kind of awkward. So we'll be using the smaller container to actually pour your emulsion. So in this same cabinet, where the emulsion is, we have a variety of these guys, which are called scoop coaters. So we've got a couple of the ones that are this size, which is a more standard size that fits our smaller screens. And then we've got just one of the larger scoop coater that's going to fit our larger screens back over here. So make sure that you're not using one of the larger scoop coaters for a smaller screen because, and generally we're gonna I'll show you here in a second, we're gonna coat our screens going this way. So if the scoop coater is too large, it's going to drag over the tape and just make a hot mess. So make sure that you've got the appropriate size scoop coater. We do have one little guy in there, a small scoop coater, which you could use for one of these smaller screens. It's this one, right? The only problem with that, it's a lot less coverage area, and that's fine. It uses less emulsion. You know, if you have a smaller image, that's okay. The only disadvantage there is you have to use more tape to tape off your image, right? So I would just use, we have a couple of these, and those are best suited for these smaller screens. All right, so here's our emulsion. Okay, again, it's in the smaller container. Here's our scoop coater. So when I'm pouring the emulsion in the scoop coater, what I'm trying to do is I want to try to pour a continuous bead of this. And so I'm going to start at the end and just kind of go all the way to the other end and just go back and forth a couple times. Try to even that out. So there's a couple ways of doing this. You can just sort of experiment and try to figure out which way is most comfortable for you. So I know some people like to use like this small little stool, and so they'll kind of prop it up against the edge of the table here, right? And so that way it's kind of anchored on the table. And some people like to use two hands, so we can do it that way. So, right, just use the table. This way you have more control, you've got two hands. Okay. So you want to have your scoop coater and place it just right above your tape line, just like that. And so I'm just going to lean it until when I'm looking down the scoop coater, the emulsion is hitting the screen all at the same time. And then I'll kind of ease it back just a little bit. And then I'm just going to, in a controlled motion, pull all the way up to the top. All right, when we get up to the top, we'll kind of slow it down, and I'll let the emulsion go back into the scoop coater, and then just pull up. So it should be a nice even coat like that. If you end up with a really kind of spotty coat, you can go back over it a second time. It's going to make the emulsion a little bit thicker, and it can be harder to wash out for that reason. So once it's coated, put it over here in the drying cabinet. Make sure that it has the emulsion side face up, not face down. And just put it right in the drying cabinet, and just make sure to close it up. One of the reasons that I get this particular brand and type of emulsion is that it gives you the ability to just coat the screen once. So other types of emulsions, and emulsion especially used in applications for like commercial printing, it needs to be really durable, and so often you'll have to have one that has to be coated, at least twice, if not several times, because it has to be able to hold up to being printed, hundreds, thousands of times, right, whatever. Since we're not doing those kind of runs, then we would need to have just, again, that thin kind of coat just on the front of the screen. The advantage that gives us is it makes it easier to wash out. Also, this emulsion does a pretty good job of holding details and things like that. So it gives us, a good quality image without having to spend a lot of time washing the screen out and then run the risk of blowing out the screen. Any excess emulsion, you can just put right back into the container. Just scrape it off right back into the same container. And try to get as much off as you can. For one, because this stuff's expensive, but also just because, you don't want this to go to waste and get dried into the scoop coater. So scrape off all that you possibly can. When your screens are drying, they need to dry for a minimum of 30 minutes. So at least 30 minutes before you can actually start putting your transparencies on the screens themselves, right? So if they go longer, that's fine. You know, if you come in one day and that's what you do for the day is just, you know, make transparencies and burn screens, that's cool. You can come back to the next class and then actually burn them. So again, the emulsion is dry. So now the next thing is going to be to start putting our transparencies onto our screens and then using the exposure unit to burn them onto the screen. So again, just give it a second, go over to make sure that it doesn't feel oily at all. If you still feel any oily residue, just get some clean newsprint, clean paper towels, go over it again and make sure there's not any residue left on there. All right, so to start, I'll just kind of eyeball this, just kind of get it in the center. With that in mind, I typically try to orient my transparency so it's a little bit bottom bias, so it's a little bit closer to the bottom. I don't want to make it to where it's so close that it's like this, right? And the reason for that is you never want to have any portion of your image, even if it's just the registration marks, too close to the edge of your screen. The reason for that is whenever we're printing, right, we're pouring ink into the other side of the screen, the well side of the screen. And so we're always going to have some little bead or film of ink that's sitting in there. And so if you have part of your image or even registration marks and they're really close to those edges, you're constantly going to have ink sitting in those areas. So those areas are going to tend to be too flooded with ink and to bleed, right? So it's going to affect your image. I say bottom bias, but that's just fairly minimal, right? So it's just a little bit closer to the bottom than it is to the top, but not to an extreme, right? Okay, so I just kind of eyeballed it for now. But what I'm going to do is actually kind of dial this in and measure where it is. The reason for that is not just because I'm OCD, it is because whatever you're trying to register each one of your layers, if you have a baseline and that gives you some starting point to know where to position your next transparency onto your next screen, that will help with registration as you kind of go through the process, right? So if I put all my transparencies in the same spot on my other screens, that again will just make it easier when you're trying to get everything set up to print. So I'm just going to move this over a little bit. So I'm going to go, in this case, 4 inches over, and I'm measuring from the outer edge of the screen. So from the outer edge of the screen, 4 inches over to the edge of my paper, right? Not to the image, to the edge of my paper. So I'll go 4 inches. And then from the bottom, let's see, we'll just do 3 1/4. That looks good. So we'll do 3 1/4. And again, that's 3 1/4 up from the bottom edge of my screen up to the bottom edge of my paper, not the image. Just apply that to all sides. And then if you need to, just kind of jot that down, make a note of that so that when you are setting up your other screens, you'll know where to position your other transparencies to your screens. So to take these down, we'll just use some clear tape. And you just need to put just a piece on every corner. So just put a piece right here in the corner, all 4 sides. Again, just double check to make sure that you have your image side face down, not face up. Very important. Image side always face down on the emulsion. And so now I'm just going to go around and just put a little piece of tape on all the corners. And try to also smooth it out as you go. Okay, so right, transparency face down on the emulsion, tape down, it's good to go. And it's possible to fit more than one screen at a time on here if there's 2 things. If they're the smaller screens, you can fit 2 at a time. Also, they have to be the same mesh screens, right? Because we're going to be exposing them at the same time, so they need to both be the same mesh count so that they can be burned together, right? If you're using the larger screens, you can only do 1 at a time on there. Make sure that your screen, very, very important, face down, okay? So the well side, which again is the open part of the screen, that is always face up. If you do it the other way, if you have the flat part of the screen, if that is face up, when the pressure comes down on it, it'll bust the screen. So make sure that you have the open, the well side face up. So then we'll drape these bleeder cords right over the edge of the screen. So the bleeder cord is basically a piece of nylon rope, and we'll just drape that right over the edge of the screen, and that'll help the air to pass over the screen. So once your screen's in place, again with the well side up, you can pull this down and just use these sweet little BMX grips to lock it in place, make sure it's locked down on both sides. There's a little chart up there you guys can reference. The basic formula that I have for determining exposure time is that you take the mesh count of the screen and then add 40, right? So for example, this one is a 200 mesh screen, so my exposure time is gonna be 240 seconds, right? So that's kind of the basic conversion that I have. And again, there's a reference up here for you. But if you don't see your particular mesh count on there, that's the basic formula. So first thing we have to do, there's two buttons here. It's a pretty simple operation. So first we're going to turn the vacuum on. That's the first button to the left. So turn the vacuum on, it turns on the vacuum. So the vacuum is going to pull all the air out of the unit, and so that's going to promote a better contact between the light source, the glass, the screen, and our transparency, right? As that's working, I'm going to check and calibrate my exposure time. So the timer's right here. So it's analog and digital. So it's analog in terms of how you actually change the numbers. It has a digital readout on the top of it. So like I said, we're doing this for 240. So I'm going to make sure that I have 240 right here. And then the S needs to just be left alone. That should already be set. That's for seconds. This one will do tenths of seconds. It will do minutes. It does all kinds of different stuff. So that S, the line underneath it, just leave it at that. And just, again, make sure that you have the actual time set that corresponds to whatever your mesh count is. Whenever this is completely flat, right, and it's pulled all the air out, then we're ready to actually turn the light on. So just wait for it to all suck down and make sure it's nice and tight around the frame. So after that happens, you can flip the second switch, just flip it up to the opposition. So just switch it on, and when you do that, it'll start the timer and also start the lights. Okay, so the lights are now on, the timer's on, and so that just needs to run for the allotted time, and then be ready to take it out and wash it out. Turn the lights off, and then basically you just need to just release the pressure by pulling the handles up, and then it's safe to go ahead and pull this out of here. Sometimes, and the main reason for that would be if your screen was not completely dry, the emulsion wasn't completely dry, but sometimes when you go to pull this off, it might stick a little bit, so be careful. If it's really stuck, let me know, and we'll try to get it off without damaging anything. But usually the main reason for that would be if you just had way too much emulsion that was like sticking to the edges that you didn't remove, and so then that's going to stick to the glass. So that would typically be the reason that would happen. But yeah, so once the timer goes off, the light is also off, so it's safe to go ahead and open the lid, pull this out, and we'll go wash it out. So just as like a courtesy, just hit it when you're done printing with the Windex, wipe it down really good. And yeah, anytime you're going to be exposing a screen on here, it's a good idea just to check to make sure it's been wiped down, because it hasn't always been. So yeah, just hit it really quick with glass cleaner, wipe it down really good before you actually try to burn anything. If it's been burned, it's safe to go ahead and have out here, because it's the light's already done its thing. So it doesn't really matter if it's exposed to the light at this point. So we just want to get our transparency off of here, and as best you can, try to avoid tearing the paper, so that if needed, if you have to burn it again for some reason, you still have the transparency. So as best you can, try to avoid tearing. If you tear the corner, it's not the end of the world, but definitely try to avoid actually tearing transparency itself so that we can reuse it if needed. And then, as best you can, try to remove the tape that was used to hold the transparency on there. All right, so our pressure washers over here. So there's actually a light, and the cord is right back here. So you have to reach down, flip the switch, turn the light on. So that backlight helps you be able to see the areas that are actually being washed out of the screen. So the pressure washer should already as far as how many PSI it's pulling. We usually have it on a pretty low setting. So at this point, we're just using a pressure washer just to wash the image out of the screen. So when we're washing it out, it's washing out the positive parts of the image. So just really be careful whenever you're using the pressure washer that you're not standing too close to the screen, because you can end up blowing out the screen, meaning you'll actually blow out the portion of the screen that are part of your image. So go ahead and pull the trigger down to get it going. Okay, so once you've gotten to the point where it looks like most of your image is washed out, you can hold it up and just check it to make sure that you don't still see any like texture or kind of like hazy area. So I'm checking my registration marks first. Those look like they're pretty well washed through. I don't see any kind of spottiness there. I don't see any of the other registration marks. So now I'm kind of looking inside of my image for the same thing. Also at this point, I'm looking at the blocked out parts of my image to see if I have any areas that were blown out or washed out. But it looks pretty good. The main reasons why your screen would potentially blow out is either too much pressure, which is already set, so don't worry about that too much. You have the wand too close to the screen. You were using thicker paper for the transparency, or the emulsion's old. But none of those should really be too much of a factor. So, most likely, if it blows out, it's because you just have the wand too close. So, I try to just keep it, about this distance away from it. There's times where if you've got like a stubborn area, you can kind of get in a little bit closer, right, to kind of knock stuff out if you just have a really stubborn spot. But you just have to really be careful. Again, because you're more likely to blow it out doing that. So that's kind of reserved just for, more extreme circumstances. Once this is washed out, you can just bring it over here to the other side and just let it drip dry. And so yeah, just follow the same procedure for all of your other screens after you burn them. Just wash them out and then set them off to the side. So you don't really need to wash it on the front. Also make sure whenever you're putting it in there to wash out, you don't start with it on the well side, right? You want to start with it on the front side, okay? And the reason for that is because the emulsion is on the front. So if we're washing it from the back, it's actually pushing out against the emulsion. So we want to be pushing the other direction. If you're pushing out against the emulsion, then you're likely again to blow it out, or it's going to make your image kind of more fuzzy. So make sure that you have the front of the screen facing you when you're washing it out. Just set aside, let it drip dry, and then you're ready to burn more screens, or when that's dry, you can get it taped up and ready to start printing. So.